Let me welcome you all, and in welcoming you, introduce the first resource person, who is Professor Madonsela, who is the host, our host today, who had the foresight of looking at matters social justice. As the chief head of statistics of Africa, I've actually suffered under her knife at one time because of violating aspects of social justice. It's a long story, but it's a story that ended well. Let me, in introducing her, just start by sharing screen and talking very, very briefly on in sharing this screen, just display that the issues of social justice are closely tied to poverty. And these are, poverty is multidimensional. And Amartya Sen, the Nobel laureate, says that human lives are battered and diminished in all kinds of different ways. And the first task is to acknowledge that deprivations of very different kinds have to be accommodated within a general overarching framework. And I think the ambition of the chair of social justice at Stellenbosch reads very appropriately from all kinds of deprivations that people are having, and these have to be accommodated in an overarching framework. And the framework that they have established is a very important one. One of the things that we have had in South Africa is adopting multidimensional poverty, where we look at economic activity, standard of living, education, and health. And when we look at all those, they are covered they cover the SDGs. With that introduction, I'll stop sharing the screen and invite Professor Thuli Madonsela to address us as a resource person. Professor Madonsela, you are welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Professor Paddy, and thank you to everyone who is in the room. I just apologize for not being here on time and therefore delaying the process. Normally, some of my colleagues don't want to present at events when we are organizing, because then you've got to balance your time and energy between coordination issues and research issues. And one of the balls might drop. And in this case, it was this one that almost really fell. And I do apologize. I want us to imagine how life goes generally. For example, when somebody is starting a business or they want to scale a business, what do they do? Can you imagine anybody just starting a business randomly without any assessment of what product are they designing? What service are they designing? Is there a market for it? Who in the market is going to use it? If, for example, I want to do wheelchairs, wouldn't I want to find out whether there are many people with disabilities? If I want to do toys for children, wouldn't I want to find out who can afford those toys, and the way I'm going to distribute them, will they be able to find those toys? And the truth is, businesses do. They do market research, they do products. The product design process starts with the market research with a view to making sure that whatever service is designed, it fits the needs of the market. If you think about, for example, how Uber has displaced the taxi industry, when the needs of society moved, the taxi industry didn't move and Uber stepped in. The same thing with Airbnb and many other industries. If you look under COVID-19, those who didn't have a product that was on the market were left out. China, for example, was the country where the coronavirus COVID-19 originated, but their GDP has grown by 3.5% in the middle of a pandemic. Why? because the products are designed for online, and the community has over years been allowed to go online. And therefore, when you design products to go online, you're saving people who are online. When we're planning a development, we do an environmental assessment, which means we worry about harm that we're going to do to the environment, to the flora and fauna in the environment. But what happens when we're designing a law, a plan, or a development initiative for people? Do we ask ourselves, who's the ideal beneficiary of this? Where are they right now? And in what way will this meet them where they are? My experience is that most of the times we don't do that. And COVID-19 became one of those experiences where we saw this indifference to difference and disadvantage approach at play. First, we decided education must go online globally. And we decided governance must go online globally. And we also decided commerce must go online globally. Eventually, we discovered that some couldn't be governed online. Then we made compensation approaches. We also discovered that not many could study online because they didn't have data devices, they didn't have data, some did not have connectivity. And then we changed, we had compensation strategies. When it comes to buying, we eventually just opened because we couldn't overnight put people online when it comes to commerce. Is this in line though with our obligations internationally and nationally? The answer I have as a social justice researcher and human rights lawyer is that this goes against our international obligations. It also goes against the law. In Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden, in Batu Star versus Minister of Environmental Affairs, and an investigation directorate. No, in these cases, 3 cases. 1, Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden. 2, Batu Star Fishing versus Minister of Environmental Affairs. And thirdly, Investigation Directorate, Serious Economic Offenses and Others versus Hyundai Motors and others. In all of these 3 cases, the Constitutional Court has said that before you approve any law or policy, you've got to ask yourself, will this comply with the equality and social duty in the Constitution? And in Van Heerden, it specifically said that that equality duty includes positive measures to redress imbalance where there's historical imbalance. And Van Heerden says, if you ignore that indifference and disadvantage, you would be in violation of the equality duty in the Constitution. And that equality duty is also there in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, and many other instruments, such as SADC instruments that we are part of. In the UK, they've got an Equality Act that makes this clearer. So they don't have a written constitution, but they have an Equality Act. Section 49 of that Equality Act says you can't approve a law before you ask yourself, before you assess what will be the social impact. So in South Africa, I do think that that fidelity to the constitutional duty was never made clear from the beginning. And I want to take responsibility here. I worked in the Department of Justice for many years. Instead, we created an Equality Act separately. But at no stage did we say, what happens with everyday decision-making? What happens with everyday policies? And I mean, if you look at Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden, it's an old case. It's been there for more than 10 years. Somebody from us, academia, somebody from government should have looked at this jurisprudence and then made it into a small template. Like there's a booklet that Joyce Maluleke and I wrote about women's rights and said, okay, this is what women's rights says in statutes. This is what the courts have said. This is what you need to do based on court jurisprudence. We haven't done the same when it comes to the equality duty, which includes making sure you're not indifferent to disadvantage and difference. But we have been advancing equality, and sometimes people are saying, no, people don't care about equality. People care about equality. The science has been wrong. So this whole thing about leveraging data analytics is what this whole project is about. At the core of it, it was then amplified by including the M plan and the fund, etc. But at the core of it is using data science to help policymakers to predict the impact of those policies on different groups that are differently situated in society, and if possible, reconsider the policy. In South Africa, Dr. Padili Khotla, sitting here with us, is now helping us to mine the data initially, to create updated data, disaggregated data that can then be used to measure or to assess whether a policy is impacting on people negatively or a future policy is going to impact on people negatively. We're doing a poverty and equality mapping exercise at Swartland, and we have designed a policy that is called SIAM, Social Justice Impact Assessment Matrix, with the intention of applying it to this. If I read firstly, before I just conclude, I wanted to say to you, the Rockefeller Foundation, we presented to them when we went to New York about 18 months or so again. They're now advancing in terms of using data science to plan better in social science. We know that data science is used to predict, for example, the likely cause of epidemics. That's why we've done better with COVID-19. It's used in science as well, in various areas of science, but we're borrowing that science because it's plastic enough to be used in social science to predict the future and to avoid a future that we don't want. So in addition here to looking at poverty mapping, in this section, we would like us to engage more meaningfully with how do we take forward this science of data analytics? How do we make sure that we don't exacerbate poverty and inequality with good intentions? Inequality operates like a pandemic and and poverty also operates with pandemic and with exponentiality. If you implement a policy and you don't realize that the poor people will be affected by their educational disadvantage, their health disadvantage, their distance disadvantage, their asset disadvantage, and all of the things that are pulling them down, you might just be surprised. For example, banks would say, to give you money, we want you to give us collateral. But if you're from Kayamandi and you own no assets, how do you provide that kind of collateral? For example, just in ending though, the case of Minister of Finance versus Van Heerden, the Constitutional Court said the following, Justice Musenik: our supreme law says more about equality than do comparable constitutions. Like other constitutions, it confers the right to equal protection and benefit of the law and the right to non-discrimination, but it also imposes a duty on organs of state to protect and promote the achievement of equality, a duty which binds the judiciary too. So that's where we're starting, dear colleagues, with understanding that we have a duty to make sure that everything we do promotes equality. And the Minister of Justice, Minister Ronald Lamola, said the same thing this morning, which means government is not against this, but it's a question of how do we in this room give them the science of doing it right. Thank you.
Madam for being a compatriot in science and elaborating that business people most of the time, whenever they plan their business ideas, they start from science. In government, not always. And we almost miss targets because of that. And by bringing this science at the very fundamental level of human rights, makes our hearts well or swell with joy, those of us who are statisticians, because I think the science have long-term partners. Juan Daviedo is the head of statistics of Colombia. He'll be presenting to us about a lot of things, but multidimensional poverty. I'm not going to take the thunder out of his sail. He'll present to us and show us what is hidden there. I was saying to him that in a journal article that I contributed in the Sage, I actually was attracted to the work that he did in Colombia. Over to you, Juan. You are muted, Juan.
Okay, thank you. Hi, Pali. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I just wanted to highlight that I'm very excited, or not to say emotional, to hear the statement of Professor Madonsela, because this is something which is highly demanding for National Statistics Office in the current situation that we are facing in our societies, that we have to allow information to illustrate the public policies that have to be designed in order to solve all the inequality challenges that are deepened and are being or are more important in the current situation when we see that the current pandemic is affecting disproportionately households under poverty, households which are with very fragile income structures, and at the same time, elder population that has very important needs in the current situation. And the rule of law that Colombia also shares, and this approach of social justice, and that's why we were very happy in order to accept the kind invitation to participate in this framework. We believe that national statistics offices should keep in mind that information that we produce has to be always has to be equity oriented, has to be gender sensitive, has to be inclusive, but at the same time has to be targeted and has to allow policymakers to efficiently use the budget that in the case of countries under which the rule of law is an status quo, we need to optimize the way the public budget is allocated in order to solve all the inequality dimensions that we are facing in our societies. So in Colombia, we wanted, under the current government, the government of President Ivan Duque, which was appointed since 2018, we wanted to put into work this framework under which information was going to be and let's say a catalyzing factor in order to develop sound public policies in such an unequal country as Colombia, but at the same time, such an heterogeneous country under which we have, let's say, 25 countries inside Colombia, because we are a very diverse society, and we need to allow information to show and to provide information about these diversity measures in order to allow from public budget, but at the same time, the main or the profile of the strategies that the public sector are both also, and also the private sector develop in some specific location. And that's why the government decided to set all the purposes of the public policy to define, let's say, a social compact around equality, a social compact about entrepreneurship, and a social compact about institutional framework or institutional trust of our society, because we have to reckon ourselves as a very as a society which is affected by an institutional trap, that citizens do not trust the government, citizens do not trust each other, and this is something very difficult to allow sustainable development to be feasible and to be effective in such a framework. And that's why the government fostered the National Statistics Office to allow the multidimensional poverty index to become, let's say, a public policy a scoreboard in order to see how the efficiency of the financial resources that are allocated to solve specific deprivations of households in our country are able to impact the NPI in all the dimensions. And that's why we have developed a very disaggregated measure of the NPI in order to allow even to local authorities to be sound as regards as targeting public efforts, policy design, but also financial resources in order to allow, let's say, social justice in our country. Something that we are very glad to hear the statement of Professor Madonsela, and we value very much the job you are doing. And please count on us. I know that we are very far away, but in technology could put us together in common objectives, and this is something which is very, very encouraging for us. And what we wanted to share with you is essentially, in Colombia, we have two frameworks to approach the situation of poverty of our households, which is let's say, the income approach, which we are not going to talk about today, but probably if you want to share our experiences, us to share our experiences about the income approach of poverty, we could have this conversation in a forthcoming session. But currently we want to see that how Colombia, since the Stiglitz Fitoussi report about how public policy and capitalism was going to be compatible with the equality of opportunities and a more integrated approach of social justice in our countries. Colombia was the multidimensional poverty index framework that was defined by OFI in Oxford University, and this is an Alcaio Foster index that, in the case of Colombia, allows us to tackle the developments of public policy in 5 main dimensions, which are the educational conditions of our population, which are the early childhood and youth conditions that all children and youngsters in our country are facing inside their households and the educational system, the dimension of the labor market, let's say, and how we are going to allow our citizens to have the right to access a sound labor market, and the health dimension, and the housing conditions of public services. Those 5 dimensions with the associated 15 characteristics have been measured in Colombia, first by a living standard survey, which is performed yearly since, we are going to say, 2010, 2011. And at the same time, we had a regional, let's say a subnational, but very aggregate subnational representativeness of the measurement of the living standards survey. And that's why the government invited the National Statistics Office to further disaggregate the information of the multidimensional poverty index at a, let's say, a state level, And that's why we increased the sample of the Living Standard Survey, which is performed yearly in Colombia. And we managed for the first time in the current history of Colombia to have a state level disaggregated multidimensional poverty index, which is something very empowering because the poverty mitigation public policy cannot be completely delegated to the central government, but requires, it's essential to have an alliance between the state level and the national level public policy, and also the private sector and the social society, the civil organizations in every department or in every state in our country. But the National Statistics Office performed that, but at the same time, we were finishing and wrapping up population and housing census in Colombia that managed to get, let's say, 12 or 13 characteristics of the multidimensional poverty index. And thanks to the fact that this was our first time in our statistical history, let's say, that we perform a population census under which every citizen voluntarily provided his or her national identification number, and passively, so invisibly, every interview was geo-referenced. So we had the XY coordinate of every interview in the population census. We managed to integrate the information of the population and housing census of Colombia of 2018 with health administrative records and the national identification database, thanks to the fact that in Colombia we have a national statistics system that empowers the National Statistics Office to have access to all administrative records in our country, either both private or public, if they are associated with the provision of public services or public utilities in our country. And that's why, taking into account that we were able to geo-reference every survey, every interview of the population and housing census. And we were able to identify from the national identification database every person that was in the housing and population census. We were able to integrate statistical and geospatial information in order to provide something that Professor Madonsela was addressing, that I think is very sound. We need to empower the public authorities to develop their task, and we need to provide information that geolocates or georeferences where are the problems. And we need to empower the citizen also to see which are the main problems in the close neighborhood that he's living at, that they are facing. So with this integration and with a very, let's say, data science approach and with a very innovative approach, we even received the advisory from Southampton University to develop some approaches. We were able, for the first time in Colombia, to allow the multidimensional poverty index to be geo-referenced at a street block level. And we were able to empower every local authority of the 1,102 municipalities that we have in Colombia to see how poverty in the dimension or in the framework of multidimensional poverty index was especially distributed in every municipality in our country. But this opportunity allowed us also to be responsive and to be responsive as regards of the current pandemic that all our countries are facing. And thanks to the fact that, again, the national population and housing census was geo-references and was enriched with the national identification database of every citizen, we were even able to integrate with more complex administrative records as the individualized health record of every system that the public health system has in Colombia, under which the case of Juan Daniel, for example, they know every moment that I went to the public sector in order to be helped or to be healed in the case that I had an illness. So this allowed us to know every comorbidity and every specific situation as regards us health of every citizen in our country, and we were able to integrate and to develop a vulnerability index as regards us COVID-19 that measures not which is the probability to get infected, but in the case that a given citizen gets infected from the COVID-19 due to the fact of his specific condition from the health perspective, from the demographic perspective, for example, his age or educational level, and at the same time, at the way the dwelling under which he's living at is characterized by overcrowding or some specific risks of inadequate materials of the dwelling, we were able to set a probability of having a higher level of complications if the population got infected for COVID-19. And this is something which is very empowering. For example, we are showing here the case of Cartagena, under which you are able to see every street block level and how can you see how poverty is distributed. And this is something that I just wanted to provide a real experience under which we would like to go, let's say, to, and I would like to ask Camilo or John to confirm that they are seeing my Google web page and that we are going to the DANE web page. John?
Yes, we are seeing it.
Okay, thank you. So in the main screen of the National Statistics Office of Colombia, you can go to this platform under which, for example, if you want to go and to see one of the main cities that is representative as regards us people from African descent, but at the same time that we have a very important challenge as regards of poverty alleviation in that city. We could go to the department of Valle del Cauca, the state of Valle del Cauca, and we could go, for example, to Buenaventura, which is at the Pacific coast of our country. And here, for example, when you go to the MPI dimension, you can see every street block of Buenaventura with the intensity of the multidimensional poverty index of every street block level. And you can see that there are some specific, for example, in this street block, 82% of the population lives under the situation of multidimensional poverty, and we can characterize which are the main dimensions that are causing this high level of MPI in this street block level. And taking into account that we were able to geo-reference that, for example, we could go also to the capital of the state of Valle del Cauca, which is Cali, and we could go to Cali and we could see not only the distribution of the multidimensional poverty, which is concentrated in some location, let's say, for example, this location, but we could see how this multidimensional poverty situation of the households is linked to the vulnerability risk of COVID-19. And for example, we could see that this location of Cali, which is Siloe, is at the same time a situation under which we could see important levels of multidimensional poverty index, and at the same time we can see that there are some street block levels that are at high risk of complications if the population that lives under these dwellings is infected by COVID-19. So the main message that we wanted to share with you is that the data science and the integration of geospatial information and statistical information could become an enabling factor in order to allow the rule of law of our countries and the social justice perspective of poverty and the inclusiveness or inclusivity dimension of the poverty measurements to be targeted and at the same time to be responsive to the specific requirements of our citizens. And this is the main effort that we are performing in Colombia. And we are working with John and with Camilo, my partners here in this presentation, in order to allow this opportunity that we had in the population and housing census to be continuous, at least at the year frequency, at a yearly frequency, in order to use some geospatial covariates techniques in order to update the distribution of poverty at the municipality levels in our country. Thank you, Professor Mandoncela. Thank you, Pali. And I'm open to the discussion.
Juan, I can see that Professor Mandoncela's smile is ear to ear because I think she really, if she was looking for an answer to the deep questions that she's been asking, this is the answer. The question is how fast and how high we can reach that. But I wouldn't like to take the wind out of the sail of the respondent, Dr. Tagi Selik from VETS. The stage is yours, but I'm very pleased that Kwan, you could share this with us, because in the MPI community of Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, we share these advancements, and I must say Colombia is right at the forefront of this process. And there's no doubt from what Kwan has presented that they are far ahead in terms of this. Over to you, Terge. Am I pronouncing your name well?
Thank you very much, Pali. Actually, you are pronouncing it very well, and it is Turgai, and but you can also use the Turgai. It's fine. It's all right. I understand what you mean, so that's all good. So perhaps I can just brief you what I do, where I am, and how I come into this discussion. And it's the first time that I'm involved with this discussion, and so that's first time that I'm expressing such a discussion. And so I'm a professor of digital transformation at the University of Witwatersrand, and also director of the Wits Institute of Data Science. And until recently, I have been running a data science program at the national level. So we have this national e-science program, which is actually training the master students on the field, in the fields of the data science. And but when we train them, we are also training the engineers, scientists, as well as the scientists from the social sciences and the humanities. So it's a mixture program, and that's where I come from, actually. And also I am an associate editor of the several technical journals, from the remote sensing to the signal processing, etc. And those journals are actually relevant to do what we want to do related with the involvement of the data science with the poverty mapping. And in terms of the presentation taking place so far, I think my colleagues have already laid the foundations of what is happening in the field, especially utilization of the data, and as well as the data analytics techniques to create the poverty mapping and to make predictions about that map is an interesting area. And especially with the geospatial products that comes from the satellites and application of those geospatial products with the machine learning and the data analytics techniques, we will be able to predict the power to map for the following few years. And there's also another factor that involves such maps is the climate and how this climate is changing. And that's also the case of actually, we need to have this cross-disciplinary discussion, and there's some people working on the climate change, and that they can also feed into this discussion. They are usually using the simulations, the large-scale simulations, to tell you what might be happening in next 5 years. And the flooding, etc., drought, etc., all these factors will be just impacting on the power to map. And so it is very interesting to see that actually how this map will be feeding into the, as my colleague just mentioned about the multidimensionality of the poverty. And so that my colleagues were just referring to how the multidimensional the poverty is, so that we're just approaching it from the different perspectives. And my perspective is mainly from the data science aspect, of course, the technology as well. But what I want to emphasize here is actually the presentation Yuan has given to us was quite impressive, but it's also a bit dangerous in terms of the how we collect such a data and then how often we update the data that will be presenting the certain prediction maps to us. And so that talks to the problem that you might be creating a poverty index, but if you are not keeping a clean and continuous data flowing into your models, and that index might be also a problem for you when you make predictions. So then that will be negatively impacting on the policies that you will be developing. So I see that definitely data science will be definitely feeding into the predictions and how the certain activities might be impacting on your policies. But also I want to emphasize that definitely the tools are there, the satellite images are there, we can just collect all the information from the simulations as well, but we also need to be cognizant of what we can do with the existing data and how we should be handling it and how we should be looking into that. And so that's what I want to say. And also, what I want to emphasize here is not only the use of the data, but also we should perhaps look into the cases where we would be getting the input not only from the data that is produced by the end user or the satellites, etc. We should be also getting the input from the directly end users who are just bearing the certain consequences of whatever the policies that we are putting in place. So then the question is how we can hear the people's voice who are actually direct consumers of the policies that you are putting in place. Then the question is this. So I just want to direct that question. And whether we would be utilizing the existing frameworks and the technology, or whether we would be using some other prediction methods or the simulations. And the question is how we can assess the impact of the policy directly on the people. So that's my question to the panel.
For your input in the discussion. What we will do is we are at almost 4 o'clock. We'll allow for questions for about 10 minutes. And then after that, we will respond to the questions. The two resource people and everybody else can respond to the inputs. Can I see by show of hand who would like to go first? We have people here on the chat, and if you want to raise your hand to make an input, please do so, or you can just unmute yourself and jump in. Can you make inputs? Should I volunteer people who want to raise questions.
Whilst I'm thinking about it, can I clarify something though?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Prof. Doc. I just want to clarify that from our angle, there are 3 dimensions to the issue, and thank you to the 2 professors from what you said. The one is the poverty and inequality mapping, which is an exercise on its own. The other is data science as a decision-making tool. So the data science as a decision-making tool need not be linked to the poverty and inequality mapping. But to the extent that we will have a map, whether it is longitudinal or static, it gives us the data we're going to mine to predict the future impact of a policy. Let's say we are planning now to, let's say government had come to us as data scientists to say we want to put education on the internet because of COVID-19, we can't have people in classroom. We would have then used existing data. In South Africa, there's a poverty map of 2018 that used data from 2011. We'd use that, and then we'd use also household surveys, whatever is available, because we can't manufacture. And then we then say, if people are sitting where they're sitting in terms of the indicators, similar to the ones that Juan has mentioned, how will they migrate into this? We test the impact of policy in the virtual space and then see how people will progress. In other words, instead of South Africa being surprised, for example, in the next 26 years that we've become an unequal society, this time we predict that if you implement policies like this, like this, like this, in 1 year's time, this is how poverty is going to be exacerbated, inequality, and then, but you're doing all of this in the virtual world, and then you can then decide, is that the pathway you want to take, or is that not the path? I just wanted to clarify. And then secondly, to say, Prof. Tege, you spoke about speaking to the people, and I'm shocked Emil is quiet, because Emil, you are in the room. The poverty and equality mapping that is being piloted at Swartland takes into account existing databases, which is the existing poverty map. It takes into account household surveys, but it does 2 things in addition. One is disaggregates the data further in terms of the groups affected, also disaggregates it to the level of a ward. And then thirdly, the survey includes interviewing people. Initially, we were going to interview everyone. COVID and money and time did not allow us to interview everyone. In some way, we're learning from what the Carnegie report did in 1932. We think if we had handled equality and poverty the way the Carnegie people handled it, we would have done better on poverty and equality. But of course, the only thing with minus is we wouldn't obviously get one group to ride on the back of another, but just that comprehensive systemic approach is what we would borrow from the Carnegie approach.
Madonzera. I see in the chat box, I'm told that we should be going back at 1600, but what I also see here is at 1600, it's a break, and then we'll convene at 1620. So I think we may not take a break. Yes. We'll move from here into that space. Of course, I'll need a few minutes to assemble the discussions for report back. Okay. Yes,
thank you very much for clarification, Prof. I think what you are referring to is raising a question, and how adaptive and flexible the policies are, and against the changes. And so when these predictions are made, basically we develop the policies based on the ones of predictions, and we make the policies not being an adaptive. I think here what you are referring to a case that Perhaps the sampling was not a good sample, and then you develop the policies based on that, make the predictions. But then you just need to make sure that these policies need to be adapted to receive the further input from the further predictions that might be formative. And that's actually what we are referring to in your case. And regarding to the feedback from the end user, the question becomes, how can we facilitate it to receive feedback more easier? And rather than just doing the surveys at a second regular intervals, can we just not use the technology and the machine learning to facilitate that process? That's the biggest question. The third question is quite important. If we can define what we mean by the equality as well as the poverty, that might be quite different depending on your context. And the quantification of that from the different factors might be easier for the data scientist. I think that is also an important factor. That's what I want to comment on. Thank you.
I don't want to monopolize. If my colleague Juan wants to answer, he can answer, and then you can call on me if you want me to say anything, sir.
Okay, let's hear Juan. Juan, over to you.
Okay, this is, I think, something very challenging, and what our colleague is mentioning is something very important, because when currently we see that data science is becoming a very important partner as regards as the production of official statistics. And we need to, in order to have this linkage or this marriage between data science and, let's say, standard statistics production, we need to have very clear which is the purpose that we want to satisfy in this integration. And as regards as national statistics offices, we are seeing that the concept of data stewardship, under which we try to produce not only sound information, but let's say relevant information for public policy purposes. We need to have a conceptual framework under which we are going to have a relationship between a statistical production or information production and the social problems or the social phenomena that we are addressing or we are trying to disentangle to the production of information. And this is something very challenging, because this requires an interdisciplinary dialogue, not only between national statistics offices and data sciences, because we are doing that. And our future as national statistics offices is have a very relevant dialogue with people like Turkey or everybody that is in data science. But at the same time, together, we have to set some interdisciplinary dialogues with the public policy framework and with the private sector in order to see how the information we are producing is going to be sound as regards as the social requirements. And this is something which I value very much from Professor Madonsela, is that everything that we are doing has to orientate or illustrate a social dimension of the citizens that we are trying to identify or to profile thanks to our information. And Pali and Turkey and Professor Madonsela, I'm very sorry, but I have to leave the session. But John and Camilo are going to represent me in answering the questions and developing everything, because I have another conference that started at 9 o'clock here in Colombia, so I'm a bit late. I'm sorry, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share this important scenario. And I hope to see you soon, Pali and Professor Madonsela and Turkey. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Gracias.
Thank you, Prof. Yes. I think the question we have to ask ourselves as a starting question is, everything else at this stage is using data science to predict how the future is likely to unfold depending on the different pathways you take. So I think the question we'll answer, just to go back to the room, is should that science be imported into policy design, social policy design? Because medical policy design uses it, climate science uses it. Why Ebola, for example, was tackled was they predicted how it was likely to unfold and what co-determinants, comorbidities were likely to enhance it, and then they contained it. And we're doing the same now with COVID-19. We may make mistakes, but we're using the science. I think we have to answer that question. Then we say, what do we have already that can do this science? Because that was our presentation to the Rockefeller Foundation. At first, they asked us a lot of questions, but guess what? Now they're moving. They've put $100 million into data science for social policy planning. So we're sitting here and we're not talking about the way, the old way where they do a causal look at your statistic, Dr. Padi. We're talking about borrowing exactly from the other sciences and say, can we do the same at social science? And I remember when I presented to the deans here at Stellenbosch University, when I came back from Harvard, the one thing they want, or is what Prof. Tege has raised, was you can't do data science only, algorithms, because also how you have taught those machines will determine the answers, and the data you fed those machines will determine the answers. You also need to include qualitative data. So if I've answered the question, this is the science we want to design in South Africa, leveraging data science for better policy planning to see how will this policy affect rural people, older people, young people, etc. And what happens in the event another pandemic comes in? For example, at the moment, everyone is saying, let's get a vaccine. But we'll get a vaccine for COVID. What if another pandemic that's not COVID comes in? What's our social science planning for that? So once we've done that, for me, then we could agree as a group and say, how do we move forward to then deal with all of these other unanswered questions, and even go back to the Rockefeller Foundation and say, you guys have moved forward. What have you discovered that we don't know? That's my view.
Yes, Professor Tege.
It's fine. And
I need to find where Barry Green is. I think you can give us in the chat how far you are, because that's our rapporteur, and we'll need to.
It's here from AIDS.
Oh, you are there. Okay.
They're specialists in data science.
So now you've got a mathematician who's got to do the work of a journalist. But nevertheless,
absolutely, got to cut across all these disciplines.
So what I've done is I've tried to extract key points made by each of the contributors, and I've starred them, and I can feed them back to you if you like, or I can send them to you when you need them. But I could just, if you want, I can just give them to you now. But everybody's heard what was said, so to try and crystallize some key points from that, I guess.
Yes, but you are going to be the rapporteur. You are going to report. Because yesterday they said I will have to go and report back, and I'm wondering whether I'll do a good job of that. And the best person who will do that is the rapporteur, not the chair of the facilitator of the session. I'm not quite sure about that.
But can I say, for me, it's not important on who says what. What is important is what do I identify as the issue? And what are the alternative pathways to resolving it? And what do we consider resolved? What we consider unresolved? What are we recommending should be done in South Africa going forward? Because it doesn't matter whose point was it. I think the room just wants to know what do we regard as an issue around data science? That's my view.
Yes.
So
what are the unanswered questions? What are the answered questions?
Yeah.
What is proposed as the way forward?
So I think, well, some of the points that have come out is that we would accept that data science is a predictive tool, It enables us to make an experiment, but then, of course, to design policy, whether it's in relation to poverty reduction, social justice, and a number of other issues. You asked us, what would we do if we didn't have it? We could avoid a future we do not want. That was a point that was made. So we don't exacerbate inequality, health distance, asset disadvantage, and so on. Yuan gave us many interesting examples, and particularly that they've moved over to action. And so they've developed a number of key interventions, tools that they can use. And then he gave us some city examples where this could be used, and a real example in terms of COVID at the moment. And then, of course, Turkey gave us made the very important point that your data mapping and your impact prediction is only as good as the data you're getting, and only as good as it is actual, in other words, up to date. And so we could be making the mistake that we are presenting a scenario which will lead to policy which may not be relevant anymore because the data is no longer really true. And then, of course, we had some general discussion. But those are a few points. I've got many points, but that's just a couple.
Well,
it's difficult to say it in five sentences.
Okay. I just do want to add to the narrative that we did say that there are two pilots that are taking place at Stellenbosch at the moment. One is the pilot at Scotland. On data mapping, on poverty and equality mapping. Another is the one at the law school where we have designed a tool that is supposed to that could be used with an algorithm, or you could use it manually to do this prediction that we're talking about. And that tool is called SIAM, Social Impact Assessment Matrix, and it has 9 dimensions that the policymaker must ask. But then they need data to feed to each dimension. Pardon?
What are you calling it? Okay, you said the social impact something to
assessment matrix. It was in my presentation. It's social impact assessment matrix. Okay, it's SIAM. If you go on the internet, you'll find a copy of it on our website. We've sent it to government. Yes, we've sent it to government.
And the Swartland initiative, this is on poverty
and inequality.
And inequality.
Yeah.
Mapping. But at that stage, it's just mapping, but it's not really the assessment part, which is what we're tackling with, is how then do you use an analytical tool to predict future, because at the moment we're going to discover what happened.
Yeah.
But we want to look at what is likely to happen in the future if they continue the way they've been doing things. And how do we then advise them to rethink areas that they might want to?
At the moment, it's a backward-looking tool like all our statistics that we have discovered. And how then do we model this to look ahead? And plan for a different outcome and their pathways. And I think, I don't know, Professor Mandonzela, the point we're making is a very powerful one. And I know we don't have time, but we've looked at all these things, and in the presence of COVID, everybody talks about modeling. Yet in the planning systems of government, we are all backward-looking. Completely backward-looking instead of forward-looking, adopting forward-looking tools. And I think the SIAM and the program here has very strong futures to change the way we do business in government.
Prof. Tege has a view, sir.
Yes, Prof. Tege.
Colleagues, perhaps definitely there will be data science tools or other statistical tools or the AI tools, technology-related tools that we would be using for the policy making and to identify the certain issues that might be the poverty, that might be the inequality, that might be some other aspects. So then it becomes about how we can make the policies adaptive and the socially responsible to adopt those changes. So that maybe today it is more about the data science, but maybe tomorrow it will be something else. So the data science will be feeding into your policymaking process. And the question becomes how we can make the policies adaptive to consume the data and the products of the data science. And that's my understanding from today's session, so that perhaps we can just consider to developing the framework to be able to put such a policies, and those policies will be adaptive and socially responsible to consume the data products. And we can call this a more like a data-informed, adaptive, and socially responsible policymaking. How we can create such a policies, how we can create such a framework. So that's what I want to say.
It seems to me that it is in line with that at the moment we're creating the data. If we had the data, for example, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing in Switzerland. We would have moved exactly to the stage where you're talking, Prof, and saying we have the data. How do we apply this tool to assess if these policies are going to lead to the South Africa that is already promised in the Constitution? You remember when I started with the fact that we have a responsibility to these people. It's a constitutional responsibility, it's a human rights responsibility, and there's 3 constitutional court cases that basically when I read them, I believe that every policy we've ever designed was wrong. Because it never asked, how is this policy going to work on older people, on rural people, on people with disabilities, on the LGBTI community? That was number 1. Number 2, will it exacerbate existing inequality? Will it exacerbate existing poverty? We never ask those questions on policy. So the idea is to design tools that would say, if you're going to ask that question, how do you measure that? Because right now government has its own tool. They call it SIEM. No, SIEX, you know it, Prof. Paddy. It's the Social Impact Assessment Matrix. I got my class, constitutional law class, to look at it. The answer is yes or no. Will this promote social cohesion? Yes or no? How do you say yes or no if you're not using any data that says if it's implemented, it's going to do 1, 2, 3, and that 1, 2, 3 is going to divide people or unite people? So that's where the data science comes in. But not alone, and taking what you say, Prof. Tege, which I think Prof. Paddy has said previously, is that you're talking about data, which is quantitative, but you're also looking at qualitative data, people in their own voices. And so going forward, it is what do we do? We can share with you what we have, which is what we're doing at. We want to work with all of you because you guys are doing data analytics, for example, for economic predictions. Now it's all numbers, but now we want to use the same science to predict how humans are going to be affected.
Respond to this, yes.
Pardon?
I'm saying using science that to see how human beings can tame and respond to this. And, yeah.
If you take where I am in Stellenbosch, for example, we're designing a policy. Will people in, for example, in Kayamandi get poorer, or will they have more difficulty in accessing whatever benefit comes with that policy compared to a suburb such as, for example, Heidelberg? Those are questions you've got to ask, but you need a science that would look at what would be the questions. And I think that, is it Theo? No, Prof. The Prof from Colombia who spoke gave us a set of 5 areas that they look at in Colombia, just on poverty. Just to remember, in South Africa, though, we'll be looking at both poverty and inequality. But Colombia is giving us a concrete example of areas that they look at. Will these areas be impacted negatively or positively? And I thought that was powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I've just sent the Zoom link for the next session, which is starting which has started already at 16:20. That's the next room that we'll be going to. But let me thank you very much, our colleagues from Colombia, Professor Madonzela for being with us, Professor Tege, Professor Green with your notes, and everyone who has been there. Professor Muleko, you joined us a little late. I see that you are there. Thank you very much, and everybody else in the chat box, and our long distance friends from Colombia.